Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Israel has carried out its deadliest bombing campaigns on Gaza in years. Dozens of people have been killed and hundreds injured. In response to the aggression, Hamas has fired rockets into Israel. The latest round of violence follows a brutal crackdown by Israeli police and soldiers on worshippers at one of Islam's holiest sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem. Large parts of Gaza are in ruins, including government and residential buildings. Tensions had been brewing for weeks as Israel stepped up its forced evictions of Palestinians to make way for illegal Israeli settlers. Fears of a widening conflict come as both the Israeli government and Palestinian Authority remain politically deadlocked. Global condemnation is also pouring in against Israel's disproportionate use of force and the mounting death toll in Gaza. So, how will these latest attacks change the political path for Israelis and Palestinians? And will the global community step forward to stop Israel's aggression? To break down the impact and consequences of this latest violence, joining me from occupied East Jerusalem is Fayrouz Sharqawi. She is the director at Grassroots Al-Quds, a Palestinian activist group. From London, Ian Black, a visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Center of the London School of Economics. And from Amman, we have Azam Tamimi, a writer and political activist. A warm welcome to you all. It's good to have you on Straight Talk. Fayrouz, this is the worst violence we've seen since the war between Israel and Gaza in 2014. Could you walk us through the latest? What is the situation like in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip?
Well, what we are witnessing in the last few days, and especially last night, and yesterday, is Palestinians uprising all over occupied Palestine. It's not just the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, also 48 occupied lands. Palestinians are reacting to more than 73 years of systematic violence and oppression by the occupation state. What we are witnessing now are Palestinians uprising against dispossession, against oppression, and against colonial policies that have been disempowering us and aiming at creating false consciousness and erasing the Palestinian identity everywhere around Palestine, especially in 48 and the eastern part of Jerusalem.
So, Azam, Hamas says it is ready to escalate the conflict in Israel. What could that look like, and where is this headed?
Well, it's difficult to really tell where it's heading. We cannot for sure know what's going to happen tomorrow. But Hamas' strategy right from the beginning has been to be gradual. They first warned the Israelis. The Israelis did not heed the warning. Then they used small-sized rockets in neighboring areas. The Israelis did not desist. The Israelis increased their onslaught on Gaza, so Hamas and other factions responded with longer-range missiles, more potent ones. The Israelis responded with even severer attacks, and therefore it's likely to continue for a while, tit for tat, until someone with authority steps in and calls on or gets all the parties to agree on some sort of a truce or a ceasefire, like happened in previous conflicts.
Okay. So, Ian, why do you think violence erupted now? Why do you think Israel chose to provoke Muslims at this holy month of Ramadan?
Well, I think that Ramadan is an important part of the timing of this escalation. The planned evictions from the East Jerusalem suburb of Sheikh Jarrah are also part of that story. But I think that in the big picture, the conflict remains unresolved. You don't need to explain that it's the most intractable conflict in the world, or certainly in the Middle East. And I think that the Biden administration needs to pay more attention to it
Yes.
than it has done so far.
Yes. We're going to take a
There's no
look at
question
how the
about that.
Biden administration would be reacting, because I think he's still evaluating the situation. So, Fayrouz, we have seen evictions like this take place over the decades in different neighborhoods of the occupied Palestinian lands. What does Sheikh Jarrah mean for Palestinians? And if the district is cleared of a few Palestinian families, what kind of an impact it will have on the future of Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation?
Palestinians in Jerusalem have been facing systematic policies of displacement. The Israeli goals for Jerusalem are to annex as much land as possible with as little Palestinian presence on it as possible. And the Sheikh Jarrah, Ian, is not a suburb. It's a central neighborhood just outside of the old city. It's a very strategic location in Jerusalem. And that is why it has been under a colonial attack and settler attack since 1967. And we are not only talking about a threat to evict a few families. We are speaking about tens of families, Palestinian families in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah that are facing the same imminent threat of being expelled from their homes. It's not just the case of 6 families that now have an eviction order that is about to be implemented against them. And that's why there is mobilization right now urgently in Sheikh Jarrah. But all Palestinians, and especially Palestinians in Jerusalem, realize that this is not just a single case. You cannot single out Sheikh Jarrah. This is the threat that is facing all Palestinians. Palestinians in Jerusalem have been evicted from their homes since 1967, systematically, legally under the Zionist Israeli law. And
Yes.
that is why people realize that we are facing the same destiny everywhere in Jerusalem.
So, Azam, what does the international law say about this forced evictions? And does this amount to ethnic cleansing, as some argue?
Well, I'm not an expert in international law, but what I hear and read is that Israeli measures with regard to Sheikh Jarrah are entirely illegal. Not only that, the occupation of the West Bank, according to international law, we are told is illegal. Settlements are illegal. The expropriation of land, the dispossession of Palestinians, all these evictions, they are all illegal. Whatever Israel has been doing to the Palestinians is actually, as we are told in international law, is illegal.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a look at the global impact of the latest violence. Ian, the Trump administration and the Gulf states touted that the Abraham Accords, which saw Israel reestablish relations with 4 Arab countries, would help bring peace in the region. But the latest violence has bashed those hopes to a certain extent. So how will Israel's aggressive and aggression impact the relations with Gulf and Arab states moving forward?
Well, it's a good question. And the Emiratis, the UAE, have raised their concerns. But of course, the abandonment by the Gulf states of the UAE and Bahrain, and also Sudan and Morocco, which have also agreed to normalize their relations with Israel, underlines the point that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not going to go away anytime soon. And the idea that somehow the normalization deals brokered by Donald Trump would contribute in any way to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians is nonsense, of course. And this latest escalation underlines that point in a very vivid way.
So you say the latest violence made the Abraham Accords an afterthought and irrelevant?
They're completely irrelevant. The nub of this conflict is the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, or if you like, the Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. There's no question about that. And the Abraham Accords are irrelevant to this latest escalation of violence.
So, Azam, why do you think the U.S. has so far adopted a hands-off approach to the latest violence? Is it downgrading the conflict's importance to U.S. foreign policy? What's your take on that?
Well, I guess Biden is embarrassed about everything that's going on because he wanted to be seen as a Zionist president of the United States of America. He is the one who once famously said that if Israel did not exist, the United States of America should invent it because it needed it, etc. But at the same time, he is faced with someone like Netanyahu, who is really, I think, in the eyes of Biden and his administration, a very ugly politician. They don't know how to deal with him. At the same time, the Arab world is not in a good shape. Remember in 2012, when the Israelis attacked Gaza, there was a powerful president in Egypt called Mohammed Morsi, whom they later on brought down and then eventually killed in prison, who forced the United States of America to act. And Hillary Clinton was dispatched immediately by Barack Obama to tell the Israelis they had to stop the attack on Gaza. So there are a number of factors involved here.
So, Fayrouz, what are the mood among the Palestinians? You just mentioned that they're uprising against this oppression and etc. But are Palestinians expecting a U.S. support?
Palestinians are in the streets saying that they are not waiting for support from outside. We have been failed, not only by the US, but by international community for decades now. And what we see happening today in Palestine are Palestinians uniting Palestine again, going out against oppression and colonialism. And people know that they have to lead the change that they wish to see in their homeland. And I think that community mobilizing and organizing is the way that for us to succeed. I think that this is a very good start, and we need to think how to continue with this, how we build the infrastructure for popular resistance, for people to be strong, for mutual aid amongst us. We do not expect the US to support Palestinians. The US is the #1 supporter of our colonizer. The US is not going to help Palestinians achieve dignity, liberation, and self-determination.
Are you talking about the third intifada here?
I do not support giving names and tags. What we are seeing now is a blessed uprising. Whether this is going to achieve the name a third intifada or not, we will wait and see. Right now, we see people who are out in the street and saying, we have had enough. We have had enough of oppression. We have had enough of international community failing us. And we are going to go out and raise a loud voice and say that, again, more than 70 years of oppression are not making us or forcing us, succeeding in forcing us to forget our right and our goal, which is liberty and freedom.
So, Ian, what's your take on the international reaction in the wake of the violence? And I mean, the situation is still fluid, but Organization of Islamic Conference called on the United Nations, Russia, European Union, and the US to stop Israel's inhuman brutalities. Arab League also condemned Israel's statements usually aren't followed up by actions. What should be the next? How could Israel's oppression in the occupied territories be stopped?
I think it's down to the United States, supported by Europe. The European Union has, I think I'm right in saying that only Sweden, as a member state, has recognized the state of Palestine. I think that more countries need to follow that example. I think the British Parliament a few years ago voted by a significant majority to recognize the state of Palestine. And I think that would send a message to Israel that occupation is unacceptable and increase the pressure for a two-state solution which is, in my view, the only viable solution to the conflict. But I think, first of all, the Biden administration needs to react far more decisively than it has done in the last few days. And I noted that I just noticed recently that the Biden administration is dispatching a special envoy to the Middle East, appointing a new envoy, and hopefully that's a good sign of greater US engagement. But of course, there are many distractions. The COVID pandemic is one of them, and the focus on the American focus on rejoining the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015.
So all eyes are set on a possible Biden administration statement. So Azam, where does this leave the Islamic world? I mean, has the Islamic world failed the Palestinians, or what they have done so far for them?
I think these recent events have ignited the Muslim world at the public level. We've seen remarks, moves that are almost unprecedented. And that is simply because Israel is increasingly tilting towards the extreme religious right. And the extreme religious right is telling the Palestinians, you have no place here. There was a time when some Israelis and some Palestinians talked about the idea of coexistence. I think we are past that period. Coexistence seems to be impossible so long as there are Jews occupying Palestine who claim God gave them a divine right to dispossess the Palestinians.
So what do you make of the Islamic world's evaluation of this violence? I mean, what should be the next plan of action? Because, I mean, I just want to read a tweet from President of the UN General Assembly, Ambassador Volkan Bozkır. He says in his tweet, the UN must act immediately to uphold its resolutions and protect Palestinians who continue to bear the brunt of the occupation. If there is a demand from the member states, I am ready to convene a General Assembly meeting to discuss the situation. So, Fayrouz, let me ask this to you. What should be the next plan of action? Are you hopeful that the United Nations could get together and this time show a political resolve, at least to make moves for a two-state solution?
I have to say that most Palestinians have little to no faith in international law. And if international community wants us to believe that it can indeed influence our political reality, then international community, the United Nations and its member states should respect international law and uphold it. There are tens of United States resolutions on Palestine that condemn and call Israel to stop its violations of human rights. But again, out of experience, we see that these UN resolutions are not being upheld. International law is not being upheld. And the international community is not using its power in order to force Israel or apply pressure on Israel to stop its violations. That is why, again, the people in the streets, they don't have hope or wait for salvation from international community. I would be surprised if international law was indeed upheld and Israel was held accountable. And that's exactly why we believe in grassroots mobilization. We believe in people storming the streets in demonstrations and protests, calling for their own decision makers and governments to take moves, to make moves and do something about the situation in Palestine. I would be surprised if international law would be applied here, because I think that the international law system is irrelevant. What calls the shots everywhere around the world and what decides political realities that we live around the world is economic interest mainly.
So, Ian, as for the domestic politics for both sides, could this latest violence save Netanyahu's political career? And what's next for him?
Well, it's hard to predict, but obviously a confrontation with the Palestinians serves his political and personal interests. He's facing corruption charges. the last Israeli elections, the fourth in 2 years, were deadlocked, as were the others. On the Palestinian side, of course, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has recently announced the postponement of elections.
Yes.
And that was deemed to be because of his fears of internal rivals within the Fatah movement, and also about the threat from Hamas in Gaza. So on both sides, there are clearly domestic political repercussions to this worrying escalation. But it's too early to say yet what those implications will be down the line.
So, Azam, how will these latest attacks change the political path for both Israelis and the Palestinians? Ian says it's hard to predict, but we know that there were going to be elections after 16 years for Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas blames Israelis for not letting thousands of Palestinians to cast their votes in the occupied East Jerusalem. So what's your take on that? Are we facing a deadlock for both societies?
I think the most significant development we've seen over the past few days is the unification of Palestinians across the land and even in the diaspora, and agreement that we have a real problem with Zionist occupation, and that coexistence with this Zionist occupation seems to be impossible. And it has also exposed the uselessness of the Palestinian Authority, and also its participation in the oppression of the Palestinians through security coordination with the Israelis. And that's why all Palestinians, if you ask them, they will tell you that security coordination by Mahmoud Abbas's authority with Israel is a major problem.
So, and Fayrouz, how do you see Palestinian politics moving forward with this latest violence and with thousands of people protesting on the streets? Will it pave the way for Palestinians, especially the younger ones, to engage in more politics to defend their basic rights?
Well, I echo what Azam just said, and I think that the Palestinian Authority is the #1 obstacle on our way to liberation. And I think that if the younger generation wants to participate in politics, then the younger generation wants a different framework of politics. Having an authority under occupation is misleading, and it creates the dangerous illusion globally that we have any kind of sovereignty anywhere in the West Bank, and that is not correct. The Palestinian Authority, by default, is a collaborator with the occupation, and so the younger generation sees the Palestinian Authority itself as a threat to our struggle for freedom, and we would like to participate in politics outside of this framework.
Ian, what's your take on that? What does it mean to have even a so-called election under the occupied territories?
Well, of course, the younger Palestinians are increasingly hostile to Abbas and the PA. They see it as self-serving, corrupt, and as was just said, effectively collaborating with the Israeli occupation.
Yes.
So some people have called for the dissolution of the PA. And a few years ago, when Oslo marked its 25th anniversary, that was quite common to hear that. But of course, the current situation, the status quo is frozen, if you like. So maybe this latest escalation will serve as a reminder, both locally to Israelis and Palestinians, and internationally, of the need to focus more on this most intractable of conflict.
Yes.
But I'm not a Palestinian, obviously, and it's up to them to decide what to do to end the occupation.
All right, Fayrouz, Ian, and Azam, unfortunately, we'll have to wrap it up in here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Aisha Subarkash. If you've got any comments, follow us and tweet us at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.